Okay. Welcome to our October meeting of the Wedgwood International Seminar Zoom lectures. Thank you for joining us today for what I know will be a very interesting lecture. Patricia Ferguson, today's speaker, is well known in the world of English ceramics. She is going to share her groundbreaking research with us on Wedgwood's portrait medallions of women. I would like to remind you that this lecture will be recorded and will join each of our previous lectures on the WIS YouTube channel. The new and vastly improved WIS website is an easy way to access the lectures by using the link www.wedgwoodinternationalseminar.org. The website conveniently links to both the WIS YouTube channel and to the WIS Facebook page. The website can be accessed either on your smartphone, your laptop, or your desktop. In addition to being able to connect to YouTube and the Facebook page, you will also be able to learn more about WIS events, how to become a member, how to support the organization, Wedgwood in the news, and how to contact us. Further, included is a section on resources listing both books and other ceramic organizations. Since our Zoom lectures began in February of 2020, it has been our great pleasure to present these lectures to you and the public free of charge. If you're not already a WIS member, why not consider joining? Since in addition to the Zoom lectures, other benefits include the annual in-person April seminar, the scholarly proceedings, which is edited by Dr. Ann Farshla-Tarish, and the fellowship of ceramic enthusiasts from around the world. You will find the WIS membership application on the website. Just a quick word on how today's meeting will be conducted. Anne will be the moderator. She will introduce our speaker, Patricia Ferguson. The lecture will be followed with time for a question and answer period. Please remember to type your questions into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. After our Q&A discussion, I'll take a minute or two just to let you know about our next Zoom lecture. So now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Anne. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. So good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us today for what will be an excellent lecture by Patricia Ferguson. I think that most of us in the ceramics field either know or know of Patricia already. She's quite the illustrious modern. She's got a master's degree from the University of London, where she studied Chinese, Japanese, and Safavid ceramics. At the Gardner Museum in Toronto, she reinstalled the European galleries. She curated Containers of Beauty, the art of floral display, as well as Your Presence is Requested, the art of dining in 18th century Europe. And she was the author of Cobalt Treasures, the Robert Murray Bell and Anne Walker Bell collection of Chinese blue and white porcelain. Between 2006 and 2017, she was a consulting curator in the Asian and ceramics departments of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And from 2017 until 2020, she was project curator in Britain, Europe, and prehistory at the British Museum, focusing on European ceramics and print sources. She's also researched the ceramic collections of the National Trust since 2003 and serves as an honorary advisor on ceramics to that organization. Patricia has published widely, including Ceramics, 400 Years of British Collecting in 100 Masterpieces, which I think won the American Ceramic Circle Annual Book Award, which is congratulations, wonderful. Also garnitures, vase sets from National Trust houses, And most recently, she published Pots, Prints, and Politics, Ceramics with an Agenda from the 14th to the 20th century, in conjunction with the British Museum, which is a great book that we've got in our library here at the museum. So please help me welcome Patricia Ferguson.
Okay. Oops, I'll just go back one. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Lorraine. Those are very wonderful introductions. I don't deserve it. But I can tell you right now that I am both honored and terrified to be speaking to the Wedgwood International Seminar. So I can only hope that you're as interested and stimulated by this subject as I am, and that we'll all walk away having learned something more this evening. As you'll see, I have trawled the depths of the internet looking for examples of women depicted by Wedgwood. And as you can imagine, often the backs aren't illustrated, the information is not as detailed as we'd like. And so I'm giving you that as a sort of caveat that, you know, it's maybe not perfect, but I'm hoping that I have given you my email address at the end of the talk. So that if you have something you'd like to share, if you've got examples that I've illustrated and I didn't have the backs, or you know where things are, please do get in touch with me, because I'd love to hear and to learn more about the subject. So I first really became interested in the portraits in 2017. I had the opportunity to write a hand list for an exhibition at Leith Hill Place, which is a National Trust property, which some of you will immediately recognize was a former home of the Vaughan William family. And so Lady Alexandra Wedgwood lent a lot of the objects. Some of it were sort of heirlooms, but a lot had been acquired by her husband and I think his father. And so it was just, you know, really truly a museum quality grouping of medallions to look at. Almost immediately, I began working at the British Museum for sort of a 3-year period. And one of my final projects there was to really, I encouraged it, but I was looking at all the medallions that are in the stores. So things that people don't get to see, which hadn't been illustrated. So you can go on the British Museum website and I have photographed the front, the back, sometimes the sides, details, just anything that I would want to look at. So it's a pretty good resource now to look at the Wedgwood medallions online. And while I was doing that, I started to become interested in these depictions of women. And so I was able to contribute last year to a free online publication, the British Art Studies Journal, which is edited by Iris Moon at the Metropolitan Museum. And the subject was the same, similar to what I'm speaking on tonight. The title is Defining a New Femininity, Josiah Wedgwood's Portrait Medallions of Sarah Siddons and his Femmes Célèbres. So that's something you can look for online, British Art Studies. And if you really wanted a copy of a link, I'm happy to send that to you. So just briefly at the British Museum, we have a fairly good collection of portrait medallions. The earliest woman is really one that was acquired in 1853, and it's a depiction of Maria, Queen of Portugal, dated 1787, and it's the gift of Joseph Meyer. And you'll know that name because he gave the wonderful collection of Wedgwood porcelains to Liverpool, but in the 1850s, he gave a small collection of portrait medallions and other things to the British Museum. So these are the sort of things I've been able to play with, as it were. So I'm just going to stop my video and I'm going to read my notes. If I can, yeah. So, Josiah Wedgwood's most famous ceramic medallion, though not a portrait, depicts a kneeling slave in chains asking, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which was the emblem of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This anti-slavery medallion was modeled in 1787 by his in-house sculptor, William Hackwood. Examples were worn as hat pins, brooches, and necklaces, and it's one of the earliest examples of a fashion item that was used to support a political cause. Wedgwood, who openly voiced his opposition to the slave trade, made and distributed the medallions entirely at his own expense. Their critical success was in part based on almost 20 years of perfecting ornamental ceramic medallions, and especially portrait medallions, which began in earnest in 1771, when one of the potter's customers, Mrs. Crewe, commissioned a portrait medallion of her son, which sadly has never been identified. Between 1773 and 1778, almost 450 different portrait medallions were produced by the entrepreneurial Staffordshire potter Josiah Wedgwood and his business partner Thomas Bentley. Wedgwood, of course, is seen here in the black basalt medallion on the right. On the left is Bentley in a 1922 copy of his 1773 portrait medallion. Evidence of both the continued popularity of these medallions, but also of the difficulty in dating this material. In the late 18th century, such medallions played to the neoclassical fashion for small-scale portraiture and collecting antique coins and cameo-carved gemstones, such as the celebrated Gonzaga cameo on the right. The vast majority of Wedgwood's portrait medallions, not surprisingly, depicted privileged white males celebrated for their accomplishments in the military and sciences, as well as politics and literature, notable members of European royal households, and long-deceased historical figures. Wedgwood and Bentley advertised these personalities in their 7 printed catalogues published between 1773 and 1788 as Class 10, Heads of Illustrious Moderns from Chaucer to the present time. The last 18th century catalogue, dated 1788, seen here on the left, was translated into French for the continental market. Of the 450 portraits produced by Wedgwood, only 66 were of women, and many of these were privately commissioned and not for commercial sale, as with this portrait of his wife Sarah, possibly modeled by Henry Weber in 1782. Wedgwood's portrait medallions have been little studied over the past few decades, and that of women, an historically marginalized group who helped shape British history and culture, is due for a critical reassessment. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the mammoth compilation published in 1973 by Wedgwood authority Robin Riley, along with George Savage, which has been long out of print. The publication assembled all known portrait models arranged alphabetically with biographical details with black and white images. It marked the bicentenary of the firm's first catalog in 1773. Next year, incidentally, is the 250th anniversary of the 1773 catalog. Riley and Savage produced the unparalleled work on the subject, and it would be an enormous task to update and revise it. But by narrowing a study to just women, much new research and thinking can be brought forward about portrait medallions. This talk then is a brief survey to introduce some of the modern British women he portrayed and includes case studies of private commissions, royal portraits, and those mentioned in his cabinet of illustrious ladies. The last includes the names of about a dozen portraits marketed in the 1787 catalog as a subclass or category simply entitled Ladies. The category was revised the following year in the 1788 French language catalog as Femmes Célèbres, or Celebrated Women. The group represented living writers, poets, educators, and aristocrats, selected and assembled by Wedgwood to form a cabinet of female worthies or illustrious modern women. Ever on the cutting edge of intellectual thought and technological innovation, Wedgwood, with a wife and several daughters of his own, would have observed that women's position in society was evolving. The economy had improved the quality of life for women of the gentry class, who had more leisure time to shop, and they were reading and writing more than ever. History was a popular subject for women writers and readers, and images of these authors were in demand as their portraits were thought to help determine their true character. Portraits of contemporary women were appearing everywhere. They were in the exhibition rooms of the Royal Academy, captured inexpensive mezzotints, and included illustrations in fashionable periodicals, such as the Ladies' Magazine, founded in 1772, and its many rivals. Here are two such plates. The one on the right is a depiction of the celebrated actress Sarah Siddons, one of Wedgwood's femmes célèbres, and on the left is the notorious Mrs. Margaret Nicholson, declared insane for attempting to stab King George III in 1786, whom I might add was not among Wedgwood's female worthies. Society was increasingly obsessed with public personalities in their private lives. Portraits and biographies thrived through the rapid distribution of books, pamphlets, and prints. But these celebrities were also subject to cruel caricatures and satires. Demand for the education of women was also progressing, with talk of schools for girls that went beyond enlightened upper-class fathers teaching their daughters the classics and sciences. Here is the frontispiece to an early publication aimed at elite families, published in Edinburgh in 1750. In the foreground, one of the women is leaning against a pedestal inscribed, "The Education of a Daughter." Wedgwood's 7 children are depicted here in this family portrait by George Stubbs, painted in 1780. Wedgwood homeschooled his daughters and was very concerned with their education, in contrast to the schooling his sons received when they were sent away to academies to prepare them for a role in the family business. He was very much aware of the limited future opportunities for his girls. Again, always at the forefront as an arbiter of design and keen follower of political opinion, as seen in the anti-slavery medallion, this new subcategory in his catalog, simply entitled Ladies, was presumably an attempt to capitalize on this growing interest in female education with a cabinet of living female worthies as role models. The market was ripe for such a challenging and stimulating idea. But did Wedgwood have a feminist agenda? Was he promoting female empowerment? Well, far from it. It appears through the selection of these specific women, he was simply defining a new form of intellectual femininity, at least initially. According to Jane Rendell, modern feminism in the late 18th century was not about equality in labor, nor an outright challenge to male power, but about recognition of moral and rational worth. Wedgwood had an amazing opportunity as an advocate for the recognition of women's rights in how he presented these women, whom he selected, and what it said to his public. However, before considering these individuals and what merited their inclusion, I want to say a few words about materiality, the ceramic bodies, and the process of production. Wedgwood and Bentley's earliest portrait medallions from about 1773 were made in black basalt. It continued in popularity well into the end of the century, seen here on the left in the unusually dramatic pose of Sarah Siddons in one of her most famous roles as Euphrasia. Basalt was a fine-grained stoneware resembling bronze with a lustrous surface which could be press molded into almost any shape and retain its sharp details. These monochrome portraits transformed and immortalized contemporary or modern portraits into a timeless classical ideal. Production of the medallions was revolutionized when jasperware was perfected in 1777, seen on the right with another model of Siddons. It was a white stoneware body composed of flint, barium, sulfate, and white firing clay, fired at a very high temperature. Whereas the early black basalt medallions often had self-frames of the same material, it was mostly assumed that the jasper plaques would be framed by his customers in metal or wood to their taste. The impact of the material on the aesthetic appearance of these medallions is striking. The jasperware could be colored or dipped in various pigments to produce blue, green, yellow, gray, black, brown, or lilac grounds. One of the most famous objects in the Wedgwood Museum in Staffordshire, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a tray of jasperware color trials, a mere sample of the over 5,000 experiments executed by Wedgwood until he felt he had found a perfect recipe. He was extremely ambitious and set difficult goals for himself in producing artwork to his high standards. One of the early problems with the colored grounds was that they bled or seeped into the white cameos during firing. To fix it, Wedgwood developed the technique of molding the bas-relief heads in untinted white clay separately before applying them to the oval-colored medallion while still leather hard and firing them together. Of course, the final product is only one element of its production process. This slide summarizes the various stages of production beginning at the extreme left. The portraits were typically commissioned by Wedgwood from sculptors or modelers. Some were taken from life when a sitter sat for a portrait. Otherwise, a portrait was found in an engraving, carved from ivory or depicted on a coin or metal, many of which were sourced in London by Bentley. Wax models were made by in-house sculptors such as William Hackwood, who was employed by Wedgwood, but professionals working outside the factory were also hired or sold the manufacturer's finished examples. The silver medal on the far left was copied in wax for this image of Queen Anne, who died in 1714, and the modeler has adapted the round format into a fashionable neoclassical oval shape. For some of the portraits in Riley and Savage, the only evidence of their existence are the working or master molds, similar to these examples, which survive in the Wedgwood Museum. Many of the 66 female heads Wedgwood produced were privately commissioned. The idea was promoted in the 1774 Catalogue of Cameos, where members of the nobility and gentry were encouraged to patronize Mr. Joachim Smith, an excellent modeler in Berners Street, an address in London near Soho, just north of Oxford Street. Smith, the catalogue stated, will model portraits in wax for them in sizes appropriate for rings, seals, bracelets at 3 guineas, or small portraits from 3 to 6 inches at 5 guineas. These wax models would be sent to the manufacturer, who made ceramic copies of these portraits in sizes from 3 to 6 inches, with the stipulation that at least 10 needed to be ordered, charged at 15 shillings each. In the age before photography, these memorials were cheaper to produce as multiple copies for distribution among friends and family than painted miniature portraits. Typically framed and hung on a wall or mounted as jewelry, the ceramic portraits offered tactile qualities not easily possible with glass-framed painted miniatures. The best known example of these private commissions is this portrait of the recently deceased Honora Edgeworth, née Sneed, whose husband Richard Lovell Edgeworth ordered 12 medallions to give as gifts to friends and family in memory of his late wife. The bas-relief portrait is impressed with her name, followed by the initials OB, an abbreviation for the Latin obit, meaning she died, and the date of her death, 1780. Edgeworth, an Anglo-Irish inventor and educationalist, along with his wife, were part of Wedgwood's social circle. And with Erasmus Darwin, they shared a common interest in scientific inquiry through the Lunar Society. Wedgwood described Mrs. Edgeworth in 1777 as a very polite, sensible, and agreeable lady, soft and gentle in her manners, and truly feminine, with a considerable share of beauty. A letter from Josiah to Dr. Darwin described Mr. Edgeworth's request in May 1780, asking for 12 profiles of my dear Mrs. Edgeworth, done in white or pale blue, from a profile by Mrs. Harrington and an excellent picture by Smart. I lost her on Sunday. Over a year later, by 2nd of June 1781, the model was recorded in the manufacturer's oven book. These 4 blue-dipped examples were perhaps among the pale blue profiles from that order. The unframed example at the center top is inscribed on the reverse, Reverend Mr. Seward. Canon Thomas Seward had raised Honora along with his own daughter, Anna Seward, and he was known for his progressive views on female education, which influenced both women in their writings. In fact, before her marriage, Honora Sneed was a well-known personality in her own right for her progressive ideas on the status of women and equality in marriage. The letter mentioned a profile by Mrs. Harrington, which is presumably a reference to an inside-out or hollow cutting by the itinerant silhouettist, Mrs. Sarah Harrington. The image on the left of an unidentified woman is typical of Harrington's work, made around 1775, where black silk fabric sits behind the profile cut as a hole in a sheet of card. Her husband's second image source that he provided, an excellent picture of Smart, is presumably a reference to a portrait miniature on ivory painted with watercolors by the talented John Smart. I'm not aware of a Smart miniature of Honora, so here is one of the Countess of Abingdon, dated 1779. These non-ceramic sources provide interesting insights into the types of small portraits owned and treasured by members of the upper classes. Honora's portrait is attributed to the sculptor John Flaxman, who is working from, having never met, presumably Honora, is working from two images provided by her husband, and perhaps with some advice from Wedgwood himself. The skilled sculptor may have added a very fashionable upswept hairstyle, very similar but not as elaborate as the one worn by the Countess, which included her braided hair wrapped around ribbons and pearls. At least two portraits of Honora are known in all-white jasper stoneware, which may reference Mr. Edgeworth's request for white profiles. They are also made in two parts, with the bust molded separately and applied to the medallion. However, both examples may have been experimental or trial pieces based on the inscriptions on the reverse. The example on the left at the V&A is incised in script, Old 1559 white. And the model on the right, sold at Bonham's, is incised, last mixture, one of 1559 and one of 3614 with cobalt in it. Now, it looks like the one on the right is slightly whiter, but I would love to see them together, but I guess they're both, anyway, maybe, who knows, someday. Significantly, the V&A example was gifted by Mrs. Ursula von Williams, who was a member of the Wedgwood family through marriage, so it may have descended through the family or have been a later acquisition by a family member, of course. But as with several other items she gave to the museum, it was probably another trial piece. One last example of a trial piece for Honora, also in the V&A, but from a different source, A.J. Tulk, is inscribed with a similar composition or recipe to that on the Bonham's profile. It appears to have used two parts of 1559, but no reference to the cobalt. And as we know, the background is covered really just with a black wash. So it isn't solid black. And we know from Robin Everson's recent lecture on black and white Wedgwood that black jasper wasn't produced until at least around 1785 to 7, and commercially for vases and other objects only from 1796 to 7, and again 1801 to 3. So this is presumably an early example of Wedgwood experimenting with that colorway, possibly around 1781. The Wedgwood factory has a long association with portraits of royal women, and presumably at this very moment, they are designing a portrait of the new Queen Consort, Camilla, or perhaps Catherine, Princess of Wales. The 1773 catalogue listed historical British queens who had served as monarchs, such as Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Mary II, and Queen Anne, under Class 9 Kings of England, which were sold as sets of 33 medallions. Queen Charlotte and King George appear together in the 1773 catalogue under miscellaneous heads, Class 11, where the Queen is described as her present majesty. That's all they say, her present majesty. Since 1765, when Wedgwood delivered an order for a tea service to Queen Charlotte, he was entitled to style himself Potter to Her Majesty, and this royal patronage proves critical to his success. Charlotte was among his most popular profiles, and there are almost a dozen different portrait models, though interestingly, Wedgwood's celebrated women did not include Queen Charlotte. The earliest portrait of the Queen may be this trial portrait medallion executed in creamware and produced in a single mold. To imitate an agate or mottled stone background, the ground has been washed with a thin black enamel. Again, it has come down through the Wedgwood and von Williams families, and the V&A website attributes its date to about 1775. So there might be a little bit more research to do on this piece. The precise inspiration has also not been identified, but the style of the hair suggests a source of the late 1760s. Another particularly early one on the extreme right of the screen is in the British Museum. It was made in the early 1770s and is also unmarked. The indirect source is the gold coronation medal by Louis Natet, issued in 1761 on the left. But the more direct source is in the engraving, a mezzotint in the center by Charles Spooner and published by Robert Sayer between 1761 and 1767. The small medallion, less than an inch in height, is a fine white stoneware, probably the material described in the 1774 catalog as a fine white terracotta with grounds enameled in different colors. It was made before Wedgwood had invented his blue-tinted jasperware in 1777, but here he is experimenting with painting the background in colored enamels, and in this example, a rich sort of lapis lazuli blue similar to antique glass. There are 4 similar models in the Royal Collection. The 2 at the top are also enameled and have fired unsuccessfully the glaze bubbling and crawling. The one on the lower right may have a light wash for pigment on the background. They may have been acquired by a member of the royal family in the early 20th century. We know, I think it was Queen Mary, who was a major collector, because I certainly suspect Wedgwood would be mortified to think of Queen Charlotte receiving medallions of this quality. The finest example of the Queen's portrait is this model, dated circa 1777, surviving here alongside a portrait of the King set into the same frame. Only the King has impressed Wedgwood and Bentley on the reverse. Unusually, both have the initials WH for the modeler William Hackwood on their truncated shoulders. In a letter to Thomas Bentley in 1777 concerning 2 medallions of William Shakespeare and David Garrick, Josiah Wedgwood wrote, "You will see by looking under the shoulder that these heads are modeled by William Hackwood, but I shall prevent his exposing himself again, now I have found it out. I shall be glad to have your opinion upon the subject. Mine is against his name being upon our articles besides W and B." Errol Manners believes that these particularly fine examples must date to around 1777, the year of the letter, before Hackwood was discouraged from signing his work, but they are also an early example of jasperware portrait medallions. An original wax model of the King by Isaac Gossett survives in the Royal Collection seen here. The wax model was probably available for sale in Gossett's London shop and not commissioned specifically by Wedgwood to be interpreted in stoneware. Gossett's understated style of modeling in a smooth ivory wax was improved with considerable alterations by Hackwood to sharpen and deepen the relief. There are many subtle variations, for example, in the ribbon on his wig, as well as in the treatment of his wig, and several details in his costume. No wax model by Gossett of the Queen has been identified. The Queen's portrait is an excellent example of the fashions of the day, with her hair entwined with pearls, her tiara, and her costume. And an especially touching element is that she's wearing a pendant with the King's portrait. While this could have been wishful marketing by Wedgwood, depicting the Queen wearing as a pendant one of his portrait medallions of the King, it may also depict part of the suite of jewels given to the Queen on their wedding day in 1761. Here is a ring from that suite in the Royal Collection Trust. Now we'll look at the idea of the cabinet of illustrious ladies. Men and a few wealthy women have been collecting carved antique gems as well as medals for centuries, stored and displayed in narrow drawers in a chest described as a cabinet, similar to this example sold by James Tassie along with 3,000 of his red sulfur impressions of antique gems. A cabinet of the heads of female worthies, present and past, who had participated in the intellectual, cultural, and political spheres of their times, would have been a novel concept in England as well as Europe, especially if this cabinet had been designed and made in uniform size and material to make, as Wedgwood himself advertised, a pretty drawer in a cabinet, though he was actually referring at the time to small medallions copying antique originals rather than depictions of modern women. Even Tassie, Wedgwood's competitor in the field of contemporary cameo-style portraiture executed in glass paste and sulfurs, included no modern female heads in his 1775 catalog, although many were listed in his 1791 catalog. However, it's unlikely, as we shall see, that Wedgwood's celebrated women were ever intended as a uniform set. Wedgwood's female worthies may have been inspired by a set of buttons painted with miniature portraits. At George III's birthday celebrations in 1773, Wedgwood observed a set of buttons with the heads of ladies eminent for beauty, and of which he was much enthused. And sadly, I haven't been able to find any appropriate ones of women, but on the right-hand side of the screen is a set of French buttons with male portraits, worn when large buttons were in fashion, and it became the subject of satire when worn by English dandies, seen in the center. If Wedgwood had based his female role models on specific publications, on a specific publication, none has been identified. The most famous collection of biographies of illustrious women was Mary Hay's female biography, published in 1803, which was too late for Wedgwood, who died in 1795. However, there had been many earlier similar publications, such as that seen here, published in 1766, which he could have used as a sort of checklist. It was written by an anonymous author, perhaps a woman, and entitled The Female Worthies, or Memoirs of the Most Illustrious Ladies of All Ages and Nations, who have been eminently distinguished for their magnanimity, learning, genius, virtue, piety, and other excellent endowments, containing, exclusive of foreigners, the lives of about 80 British ladies, collected from history and the most approved biographers and brought down to the present time. Before the introduction of the subcategory ladies in 1787, the first woman to be included under Illustrious Moderns, Class 10, in the Catalogue of Cameos 1773 was Madame Dacier, a familiar name to anyone educated in the classics, Wedgwood and Bentley's chief commercial focus. She is the only modern woman to appear among 46 men arranged chronologically from Geoffrey Chaucer to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, including Shakespeare, Martin Luther, Inigo Jones, and Carlo Maratta. Her populist translations with commentaries, especially of Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were especially appreciated by learned women. Born Anne Lefebvre as a young girl, she was taught ancient Greek and Latin by her father, professor of classics, and had achieved scholarly attention before she married André Dacier in 1684. A role model, her entry in Biographiam Femininium, I've just shown you this cover of it, emphasized modesty as one of her virtues with her quote, "Silence is a woman's ornament," from a verse in Sophocles. Her inclusion was not exceptionalism, but based on her achievements as a widely respected scholar. And here she is, the pug-nosed Madame Dacier, in black basalt, which is after an ivory carving attributed to the French émigré carver David Le Marchand, who came to London around 1705, and the ivory is now in the British Museum. Le Marchand is the author of another ivory carving of an unidentified male thought by association to be André Dacier, her husband. Wedgwood and Bentley also issued a model of this male portrait in 1773, identified as Monsieur Boileau, the French poet and critic Nicolas Boileau de Préau, and marketed as a pendant to Madame Dacier in 1777. There are some discrepancies among the few, mostly engraved portraits of Madame Dacier, and a working mold in the Wedgwood collection of the same profile is ascribed Madame Dacier. However, a later Wedgwood portrait with self-frame and painted in polychrome enamels is also identified as Madame Dacier, which is after this French engraving by de Rocher, and bears little resemblance to the profile of the ivory portrait. The unusual portrait medallion is apparently part of a group, perhaps produced as a set in the early 19th century, which are incised with the names of the sitters on the reverse, and in one example certainly has Wedgwood stamped on it. I find this group really quite interesting, and if anybody knows more about them, I would be, as you can see, I'm sort of collecting examples because they're kind of interesting. But now let's focus on the celebrated modern women who Wedgwood offered for sale in his catalogue. The best way to understand Wedgwood's strategy is to consider the selection chronologically, using the evidence found in the catalogues. By narrowing the focus to only portraits of contemporary British women, we have an opportunity to make some observations of his rationale. The importance of ladies as consumers and patrons of his portrait medallions and cameos is underscored in the flattering introduction to his catalog. The ladies may display their taste 1,000 ways in the application of these cameos, and thus lead artists to a better style in ornamenting their work. In the 1787 catalog, under the Illustrious Moderns, appears several new subsections, as you can see with those black arrows. Philosophers, physicians, English poets, painters, architects, antiquarians, and divines. And at the very bottom of the list was the subsection, ladies. The generic term described women of high social class or status with positions of authority over domestic spheres, typically realized through marriage or inheritance. However, it was apparently soon found inadequate to introduce portraits of women whose achievements were to be celebrated as writers, poets, and artists. While the women were still not considered equals, listed in the same categories as men, a new term appeared in the French edition in 1788, replacing ladies with a more appropriate title, femme célèbre. Here we have the 1787 list of illustrious ladies. I have highlighted in yellow the 7 contemporary British women: the Duchess of Devonshire, Lady Banks, Lady Charlotte Finch, Mrs. Montagu, Mrs. Barbeau, Mrs. Kennicott, and Mrs. Siddons. Except for Mrs. Kennicott, even 250 years on, they are all relatively familiar names. The other 16 women are primarily French, who lived between the 15th and 18th centuries. They include a mathematician, author, and natural philosopher, the Marquise de Châtelet, among a few women of letters, but for the majority, their entree to historical significance was either beauty, marriage to a European sovereign, or scandalous notoriety as the mistress of a famous man. Well-read British women would have been familiar with these historical females through Biographium Feminaeum and other publications. As an enlightened thinker at the forefront of fashion and taste, it'd be tempting to assume Wedgwood had an agenda in the selection of these historic women. But in fact, it seems they were part of a propitious purchase by Bentley in Paris in 1776. In that year, Bentley purchased a cabinet or a set of portrait medals for Wedgwood to copy. The set doesn't appear to have survived in the factory archives in Staffordshire, and we know only that they were made between 1750 and 1773. They are rare, and nothing is known about the sculptor, who signed several examples as Pezet, possibly or perhaps a pseudonym. The set included 120 male and 23 female busts, each a single-sided ornamental cast bronze medal. Their uniform size indicates they were completed as a cabinet for amateur collectors. Here is one of the Pezet medals depicting Madame de Pompadour with its possible print source. It's a 20th century example, recognizable by the curved rather than the cut edges, as no 18th century example has been identified. So the choice of these historic European women was economical. He had them to hand, ready-made. And interestingly, very few survive, suggesting they weren't especially popular. Wedgwood's choice of contemporary British women included firstly Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, née Spencer, the richest woman in England. She was celebrated for her female empowerment, political influence, and intellectualism, all at great personal cost. Wedgwood's portrait medallion of the aristocrat, attributed to John Flaxman and perhaps taken from life, was first recorded in 1782. Seemingly, she was an obvious role model, but that at the time of the catalogue, in 1787, however, the populist Duchess had been leading a scandalous private life, pilloried in the press and satirical prints. Famously, during the general election of 1784, Georgiana became a major subject of scrutiny, when she was ridiculed for securing votes in exchange for sexual and monetary rewards. The satirist depicted her trading kisses for votes, yet she was instrumental in the success of the Honorable Charles James Fox, an anti-slavery campaigner, and also an early supporter of the French Revolution. Next, the heiress Lady Dorothea Banks, wife of the distinguished explorer and botanist Sir Joseph Banks, a member of the elite society, and by all accounts, a virtuous woman. In 1779, at the age of 21, she married Joseph Banks, who was by then president of the Royal Society and living with his sister in 32 Soho Square. Dorothea was had a good-natured temperament and got on very well with her sister-in-law, Sarah Sophia, who continued to live with them and whose collection of 10,000 coins and everyday ephemera were presented to the British Museum immediately upon her death in 1819. Dorothea was a keen collector of porcelain, a little old China mad in the words of her husband, and she is said to have benefited from his connections with Chinese scholars such as George Staunton and the superintendent of the factory, or one of them, David Lance. Wedgwood had probably commissioned portraits of both Sir Joseph and Lady Banks around 1782, so again, she was already in stock, as it were, and must have approved the commercial use of her portrait. Next was Lady Charlotte Finch, governess in ordinary to the children of George III from 1762 to 1792, and was 50 years old in 1774 when the medallion was first introduced. She shared an interest in education with Queen Charlotte and followed new trends in its theory and practice in the royal nursery, especially in the use of educational toys, topics of interest to Wedgwood. In 1774, Lady Charlotte Finch had commissioned portraits of her daughters, seen here, all with the experimental enameled backgrounds, as seen earlier. No finished medallions are known of Lady Charlotte Finch, and again, the model may not have been commercially successful. But if anybody has a copy or knows where one is, I would love to know. No portrait of Mrs. Anne Kennicott has been identified, though she is said to have resembled Queen Charlotte. Her husband was the preacher and Hebrew scholar Benjamin Kennicott, librarian of the Radcliffe Library in Oxford. A friend of the novelist Fanny Burney, actress Ava Marie Garrick, and moralist Hannah Moore, she attended meetings of the Blue Stocking Circle, studied Hebrew to assist her husband in his translations, and was a supporter of the abolition of the slave trade. So although an academic and an appropriate choice as a role model, she does not appear to have been in demand. On the other hand, the glamorous and imperious tragedian Sarah Siddons was one of the first true celebrities. From 1782, her image generated a fetishistic admiration among Georgian women who empathized with her character and the emotions she was free to express on stage. Unlike other actresses whose reputations were tarnished with a persistent association with prostitution, the renown of Sarah Siddons' virtue and professionalism, reinforced by her choice of roles, must have appealed to Wedgwood. There are two models of Sarah Siddons in the character of Euphrasia, both attributed to John Flaxman. But as I've argued in that article online in British Art Studies, she obviously had something to do with the one in the center, because the one on the right, again, is the only known example. So it's as if it never really went into circulation. By tradition, the attribution to the sculptor, John Flaxman, is on the strength that in 1782 to 1783, he molded a bust of Mr. and Mrs. Siddons for the factory, which hasn't really been identified, certainly not Mr. Siddons. The earliest depiction of Mrs. Siddons as Euphrasia was painted by William Hamilton, seen in the previous slide, and exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1780. Only a few images in her role as Euphrasia were in circulation in 1782, as here with the actress standing and clutching the handle of a dagger hidden in her skirt. It is said to be after a pastel drawing executed in 1782 by a 13-year-old fan, the painter Sir Thomas Lawrence, who became a lifelong friend, and the date of the print is 1783. In my online article, I have argued that this popular portrait medallion may have been heavily influenced by the actress herself, who controlled her public image, if not actually designed by her. Later in life, Siddons trained as a sculptor and produced a Wedgwood-style self-portrait medallion as a virtuous Greco-Roman matron, seen here, published in the Monthly Mirror in 1796. And I'm very grateful to Iris Moon, who really encouraged me to look more seriously at this portrait of Siddons. And as you can see so far in the examples I've shown, this twisted torso portrait, the really strong jaw, is unlike any of the other sort of very demure depictions that we've seen. Next, Mrs. Elizabeth Montagu was known as the Queen of the Blue Stockings for her Parisian-style intellectual assemblies attended by writers, artists, actors, and philosophers. The privileged Blue Stockings celebrated friendship, charity, and female education as the foundation of modern civilized society. The portrait by an unidentified sculptor has transformed the recently widowed Mrs. Montagu into this stoic Herculaneum matron. In 1776, this image was reproduced in the Westminster Magazine alongside the image of the dissenting British writer and poet Anna Letitia Barbeau, whose Wedgwood portrait medallion was modeled 2 years earlier in 1774 by the wax sculptor Joachim Smith. It was made shortly after she had become one of the most famous female poets, admired as a political and social visionary, and both were obvious choices for his cabinet of female worthies. Clearly, Wedgwood was at the vanguard of public interest and had the novel idea for a category devoted to modern women, marketed at his female customers. But in the end, he relied on an assemblage of existing models in slightly out-of-date fashions rather than recent commissions. The 1788 catalog for the continental market was a translation of the 1787 version, but as noted earlier, the name Ladies was changed to Femme Célèbre. While not technically listed under this category, the catalog was updated with 5 new female heads in very fashionable dress, which appeared in a supplement at the end. The royal and aristocratic names are highlighted in yellow: the Princesse de Lamballe, the Queen of Portugal, the Princess Royal of Britain, Marchioness of Buckingham, and Lady de la Pole. All of these 5 new female heads were recent commissions and stylistically attributable to John Charles Lochet, a sculptor and wax modeler who at one point was portrait modeler to His Royal Highness Prince William. Lochet is immediately recognizable for his over-flamboyant manner resulting from deep undercutting. His style was well suited to the newly fashionable and naturalistic coiffure à l'enfant. For the hairstyle, a woman's hair was cut just beneath the ears at the sides of the face, powdered, teased, and curled for volume, with long wavy ringlets at the back. The coiffure was apparently introduced in the early 1780s by Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, who was suffering from hair loss. In this portrait, she can be seen with her hair in the new fashion. It's also captured in a Wedgwood portrait model, again rare, but which wasn't listed in the 1788 catalog. And again, this is a 20th century, probably an early 20th century model. The hairstyle was quickly adopted by her loyal courtiers, including Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy, Princesse de Lamballe, seen here, who may have popularized it when she visited England in the summer of 1787. In that same year, Flaxman, Wedgwood's principal modeler, had left for Italy, and Wedgwood, with few alternative sculptors, must have turned to the talented Lochet, who also possessed an impressive client list thanks to his royal connections. While there's no direct source for the portrait of Lamballe, who may have sat for a wax model, it's amusing to think that the ceramic model was copied in an engraved book illustrating the princess. The choice of the Queen of Portugal and of Britain's Princess Royal are not surprising commercially, given that they would have had a big fan base. The coiffure of the latter on the right, the Princess Royal, has additional height achieved by a plume of ostrich feathers, as was the fashion of the day. In terms of personal achievements, however, there's little to recommend the recent Catholic convert and heiress Mary Elizabeth Grenville, née Nugent, Marchioness of Buckingham, other than being a leading aristocrat. Around 1787, Wedgwood had commissioned Lochet to copy antique gems in her husband's collection at Stowe. So he may have been flattering the socially and politically important couple by including portraits of both the Marchioness and her husband, the first Marquess of Buckingham, in the 1788 catalogue. Finally, on the extreme right, Lady Anne de la Pole. She was the daughter of a self-made magnate who had married the heir of a West Indian plantation. Here she is painted by George Romney 2 years before the portrait medallion was produced. Perhaps she was a Georgian it girl known for her beauty and fashion sense, whose fleeting importance is now lost, but her visual legacy survives in perpetuity in a Wedgwood medallion. An interesting side note is that there's an example elsewhere of a blue jasper ground impressed Wedgwood plaque or medallion at the Metropolitan Museum. And it's inscribed on the reverse, the gift of Sir John and Lady Pole to Richard Mollusk, dated 1788, suggesting that the sitter acquired at least one example as a gift and presented it to someone. However, Lady Mole may have commissioned a wax portrait from Lochet and had a dozen or so made by Wedgwood, who, appreciating its commercial qualities, may have asked if he could include it in the catalogue. In conclusion, with his illustrious female moderns, Wedgwood had the opportunity to create a modern gallery of portraits of his own choice by commissioning original artwork. However, with the exception of the Lochet portraits, which clearly form an aesthetic uniform cabinet, there was no obvious methodical arrangement. The 1788 catalogue was the last produced by the manufacturer in the 18th century. And if his cabinet of femmes celebres or illustrious women developed further, there's no obvious evidence of it. Interest in commissioning ceramic portrait medallions waned by the early 19th century and was only really revived for collectors in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Having brought this group of 28 women together, Wedgwood achieved an agenda of sorts by showcasing educated, elite white women of immense privilege and beauty. It was a commodification of women designed to appeal to his female clients. Gazing back through a 21st century lens, there were so many more interesting contemporary British women who might have been included. The historian Catherine Macaulay or other women of letters such as Mary Wollstonecraft, Hannah More, and Elizabeth Carter, though they were perhaps too controversial. Wedgwood might have included female artists such as Anne Seymour Dahmer, Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, Lady Diana Beauclerk, Elizabeth Lady Templeton, or Emma Crewe. The last three were actually employed by Wedgwood for their design skills. Throughout his career, Wedgwood aggressively courted royal and aristocratic female patrons, as they had the ability to influence other women, which is apparent in the selection of celebrated contemporary women. Still, the inclusion of such outspoken women as Mrs. Barbeau, Mrs. Montagu, and the Duchess of Devonshire, each publicly ridiculed for their desire for the recognition of political and civil equality, is admirable. While not an overt agenda for female empowerment, Wedgwood sent a clear message to his daughters and customers. Women needed to have their place in society acknowledged, which he achieved by also promoting aristocrats and celebrities who guaranteed its commercial success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was really fascinating.
Good.
Lots of fun information. I'm going to now look at the chat.
I'll just stop share.
And I will start at the beginning. First question, who were the scandalous and femme celeb women?
You mean, well, I think I've named some of them. Mary Wollstonecraft, a lot of these authors who were sort of, speaking out on behalf of women. And as I've said, they really weren't the ones that were kind of included. He was looking for a certain type of woman, I think. Women that he wanted as role models for his children and friends of friends, kind of.
Adele Barnett has a comment. She has the portraits of Lady Finch's daughters in the form of cameos on a jardiniere.
Oh, okay. Oh, I
You,
may have
Adele?
seen that on one of the, I don't know if she bought it in the last 10 years or 20 years, but.
I do not know. Another question, was Matthew Bolton's wife the subject of a medallion?
Good question. No, I don't think so. But that's it. That would be an obvious one, wouldn't it? I don't think so. And I could check Riley, but I don't have it with me.
Would be an obvious one, but yeah.
Well, there's a lot of obvious ones. Yeah.
Yeah, you would think. Yeah. Who is Mr. de la Pole?
Oh, I think there's not much. not much on, I mean, he's just a wealthy landowner who has, I think he's got a plantation. That must be some of the source of their wealth. I mean, I tried in most cases, and I don't think there was anything particularly, I mean, I'm sure there's something on Wikipedia, but nothing really outstanding from my point of view.
Sophie Guinea has a mystery medallion that would like to share on screen if that's possible. We'll ask David if that's possible. It was reproduced in the late 19th century, misidentified, but it's obviously 18th century. David, can we let Sophie Guinea share her screen briefly? Oh, there it is. She's got it there, but I see. She doesn't need to share, but interesting.
Have you been through Riley on that, or, and it's not there?
You're on mute, Sophie.
Thank you, host. I was trying to unmute. Riley notes her as unidentified and possibly Lady Frances Crewe, but there is nothing to go by. I was just curious if anyone else had seen it, because yes, the Madeline de Scuderi one exists, but it's obviously not her. She is one of those very fashionable ladies with the pearl in the hair and the lovely ringlets. So what you mentioned about there being private commissions is particularly interesting, because she's not one of the list, but, and this is, rounded edges, it's quite obviously a 19th century reproduction when somebody was going back through the molds at Etruria, but I just curious if someone else or you had seen it in your research.
Just to say, it's not, is it the one that's published in Riley or not?
Yes, it's published in Riley and unidentified.
That particular one, or?
Oh, I have no idea. I found it on eBay years ago.
Yeah, he doesn't always provide the source. So, I mean, that's just kind of interesting if it's another one floating around.
Another question. Do you see enamel on copper plaques of the same female subjects? And if so, do you know how their prices compared?
Oh, I can't speak about prices. I don't know, but at the certainly at the V&A, at the British Museum, we have a group of transfer printed on enamel portraits of women and men that might be a little, I think they're about contemporary in date. So that's printed. And of course, there's lots of painted women, but they're not really very well done, the majority. But you do get very, very fine enameled ones by people like Zinc and other, skilled enamel artists. So not much of an answer, but.
I have a question about those models that you have or that are at the Victoria and Albert Museum that were essentially never used to create, or at least we don't have any examples of Wedgwood medallions. So how extensive is that collection, and were those published in the Riley Portrait Medallions book, or or not? I just can't remember, but just curious.
They're you can see they belong to Wedgwood Barlaston, World of Wedgwood, and they're all illustrated on the V&A website, so you can see all these sort of making mold pieces, working molds and master molds. Riley does illustrate some of them as in the only known example of this person, and many of them have inscriptions on them, so he's relying on that to identify the sitter, I think. And I mean, yeah, it's also a very interesting group of objects to look at, because I think they're quite rich, and I don't think it's really been transcribed, the information on the pieces. So that's more work for the people in Wedgwood.
Yeah, a great project. Are there any other questions? We have a lot of comments and kudos for a great talk, Patricia, in the in the chat as well.
Okay.
Are there any additional questions? Well, thank you so much again, and I'll turn things back over to Lorraine.
Thank you, Anne. So thank you to all of you for joining us today for today's lecture. Our next WIS Zoom lecture will be held again on a Friday, as we always do, and it will be in February, Friday. I'm not giving you the date yet. You will find out about the date, but it'll be on a Friday at our usual time, which is 2:30 on the East Coast in the US and 7:30 p.m. in the UK. The specific information about the February lecture and the Zoom link will be emailed to members, and it will also be sent to many other English ceramic groups, and those groups will distribute them to their members. The Zoom lectures, all of the ones that we've done, as I mentioned earlier, will always be found on our WIS YouTube channel. You can access it through the website. Keep in mind that for every Zoom lecture that we do, we use the same link, so you might want to keep that link handy. Thank you, Patricia, for this astounding lecture. We in my house, Jeffrey and I, incredibly appreciate this, as we are huge medallion collectors. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Stay well, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see all of you in February. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Thank you.